Sombra. Depending on the person, this name carries different meanings. To some, she's a utility-based DPS. To others, she's a stealth-based assassin. To me, you ask? Well, she's all of these things. Sombra is Overwatch's Identity Crisis. So, 2016, the first iteration of Sombra was released. Yes, first iteration, this girl is the most reworked character in Overwatch history.
Let us discuss your failures.
So after making my Sombra video, it was brought up to me that Symmetra exists, and I'm not gonna lie, I actually kind of forgot that Symmetra existed for quite a while, since, you know what, Sombra's been the one who's been having all the issues recently, and Symmetra's been a closed case for quite a bit. But you know what? A little history lesson has never done anyone any harm. So let's talk about Symmetra, Overwatch's first identity crisis. Like the last video, I'll be talking about Symmetra's history first, and then we'll be getting into the game design talk. But if you already know her full history, well, you can feel free to skip ahead if you so please. Starting with her release, and just like, sweet Jesus, what was going through their heads. So, Sim's first version, if compared to her current one, is one of the most drastic shifts in any game I have seen for a character, or at the very least in Overwatch is one of the most drastic. Starting with her primary fire, it was similar to what she had today, except it was much shorter range, and was also an auto-lock. It would still ramp up over time, but it did do less damage as a result. Her old secondary fire is pretty similar to what we have today, only everything about it, and I mean everything, was slower. Had a slower charge time, slower travel time, slower damage. This thing was pretty bad if you were going to be using it as a long-range tool, but it did pierce enemies. So if you ever saw a nice group coming through a tight little corridor, well, that thing was right-click central for you. Her turrets were similar enough, except they were just infinitely worse. She could only carry 3 at the time, although she was able to place down a max of 6, which is bizarre. But also, they only had 1 HP, and their damage wasn't that good, the slow on them wasn't that good, they weren't that good. This was not a good ability. Now next, the thing that so many people forget, and even I forget half the time, is that Sim used to give shields on release. And I mean she would add shields to your HP pool. And pretty much all that would happen is at the very beginning of the game, Sim would give this to everyone on her team, and then it would never happen again. And finally, her ult was the good old-fashioned teleporter. You would place this down literally anywhere on the map, in your spawn, and entrance would appear, and they would exit at this teleporter, which had a certain amount of uses. I can't for the life of me find the actual amount, which infuriates me. It was pretty much ideal on stuff like 2CP because it would just let you completely cut down on the time that it would take to go to a point and start stalling it out. And it was absolutely massive for that, but the instant you were either on second point defense on 2CP, this thing was useless, or if you were on like first point attack of 2CP, it was also pretty useless. It was not a very strong ultimate and it was extremely map dependent. Oh yeah, and Symmetra, right, she was also a support. Now this version was short-lived because after only just a few months, she got her first rework. Her HP shields were replaced with photon shields, which was like an automatic version of Sigma barrier that kept going forward. Her primary fire and secondary fire stayed the same, but the only difference being a range buff for her primary. She was also given the ability to hold 6 turrets, but most notably she gained a second ultimate. Shield Generator was added alongside TP, which gave shields to allies who were in its radius and also gave us the best voice line in the game.
I'm getting the feeling they have a shield generator.
Both TP and Shield Generator were given new HP totals, getting some shields as well, but that's just for quality of life. After this first rework, Sim went on pure radio silence in terms of changes. Not a single one for 2 straight years. During this time, people were calling for her to get another rework, along with a certain Swede who was also in need of one, though it took quite a while, we eventually got our answer. June 2018, Symmetra's second rework finally went live and everything was changed. First, she was actually changed to be a DPS, which I'll get into a little bit more later. Next, her primary fire now dealt more damage, had more range, and took longer to ramp up, but no longer auto-targeted. Also, the max ammo went down to 70 from 100. Her secondary fire no longer pierced, travelled faster, charged faster, and was given explosion damage for 120 in total. Next, turrets changed back down to only 3, but having a max of 3 placed at any time. They also received more HP, were now thrown out like projectiles to be placed down, and were given a stronger slow and more damage. TP was removed from ult and turned into an ability which placed the exit away from Sim, lasting 10 seconds and could now TP to way more things, which led to many stupidly brilliant strategies. He also received a new ult, Photon Barrier, a shield which takes up the whole ass map and has 5000 HP, but I think most of you know it from a certain screenshot from 2020. She only got a small number of changes for quite a while, things like damage increases and quality of life changes, but in August 2019, TP was changed to last forever, given more range, and Sim could now destroy it if she wanted, with the cooldown not starting until it was destroyed. This change was extremely divisive among Sim players, but again, a little bit more on that later. The rest of her changes in Overwatch 1, again, were all just number adjustments. Come the Overwatch 2 beta, she got an ammo increase along with a load of number changes to her secondary fire, like a speed increase, charge time increase, ammo cost increase, damage decrease, projectile size got lowered. The TP build time got lowered, but we returned to a temporary TP from the second rework, along with a cooldown starting when the TP was placed in exchange for a 16-second cooldown. Turrets also got their slow decreased to 15%, but travel time went up. She also got another change later in the beta, getting her TP CD lowered to 12 seconds and a revert on the projectile size and charge time changes on her secondary fire, which I warn you all now is a frequent occurrence with Sim, getting one change only for it to get reverted literally the next patch. Again, she mainly got number changes for quite a while, except for one patch amongst the number changes that stood out to me since I didn't know this existed. Secondary fire damage got a buff. But more importantly, when damaging a barrier or shield HP pool with her primary fire, Sim would recover 30 shield health per second. Her turret DPS also got lowered, but in exchange, she now gains vision through walls when they damage a target that lasts for a second after the last instance of damage. And as per usual, she got more and more small number changes up to the time of this video. But the funniest thing is that so many of them keep getting reverted. Like most recently, she got a damage buff on primary fire, which was immediately reverted in just a week. Like the poor girl cannot catch a break. So, that's the history of Symmetra, but let's take another rewind so that we can go through and start talking about the actual design behind all of her kits, technically. Now, I didn't play Overwatch back in 2016, so I never played as or against the OG Symmetra, but what I can say is from the little bit of digging that I've done, just to see what other people think about her, it could pretty much be boiled down into just one sentence. What the fuck? Sim's original version is where her identity crisis began. Like this, it was instant. It was not like Sombra where it was like kind of there, like it was just immediate. She was a support, but she was a support who didn't heal. Now, at the time, there were only 4 supports. It was either Mercy, Lucio, Zen, or Sim who you would play, and that was it. A lot of comparisons were drawn between her and Torbjorn, since they were very similar. They both relied on turrets for a good chunk of their damage, and they would both add to your HP pool with stuff like armor or shields. But the difference between the two of them is their designation. Torb has always been a DPS, and even his first version, they always gave him tools to just kill people. That was his main goal, it was do damage. In Symmetra's case, she was meant to be a support for her team, giving them shields, giving them a way to shorten out the time it takes them to come back from spawn, and then adding some slows and things like that with her turrets. But she was just effectively a glorified DPS. While yes, it wasn't decided on back then that supports had to be healers, that was a much later design decision that Blizzard ended up making, it certainly was not helpful. The utility that she provided was grand. I mean, it wasn't terrible. You wouldn't complain about having it, but realistically, you'd nearly just rather have the Torb, especially since his turret and him actually have range as well. Obviously, as an example, Torb is kind of flawed since he also got reworked, but both of these characters have needed reworks and both of them have had problems, so I think it works out pretty fine. Now, while I have never played with or against the original Sim, I did experience her first rework, which was certainly an experience. She was definitely more useful than before, especially thanks to having all her turrets available immediately, and the new barrier was certainly useful depending on the circumstances, but if anything, even with shield generator still keeping her supportive shielding alive, you weren't going to have it every fight, and sometimes you'd be better off with a TP depending on the situation. This rework still had her in the support role, but not only was she closer to a DPS than before, by now the community had actually gotten at least half decent at the game, and we're starting to figure out that a 2-2-2 composition was typically the optimal one for most situations. And having Sim as your second support was not going to do anyone any favors. Back in this time, a lot of characters were labeled as throw picks. Hanzo, Torb, Bastion, Widow were the typical ones, but out of all the possible characters, Symmetra was one of the ones where people would really lose their minds. And they continued to lose them whenever Sim was on their team, since the value she provided was just lower than other characters. Was she your second support in a 2-2-2 that you somehow managed to get in a solo queue comp game? Well, that lone Mercy isn't keeping your whole team alive. Was she acting as your second DPS? Well, that works, but one AoE instance of damage and your turret utility is erased since they all only had 1 HP, which by extension lowers your overall damage immensely. Whether it's original Sim or her first rework, she's always been a bit of a pub stomper. She'd do amazing in low elo, because none of them could aim, so she worked out perfectly for them, but also no one would shoot her turrets immediately, no one could shoot her to begin with if they were playing someone like Soldier, and of course, they were just dumb. People wouldn't be going around shooting her turrets or dealing with shield generators properly until you got to like Platinum, honestly. And with the further that you would climb if you were, say, only playing Sim, the more and more useless you would eventually become, even more so on maps where she just wasn't a good pick. As we all know, characters who are only good in a certain elo, and I don't mean, oh yeah, this one's just stronger down here, I mean flat out, I can only work if people are idiots, is not good game design, and it's not something that both players want, and it's definitely not something that even devs want to begin with, which is of course why Symmetra got reworked again. Symmetra's first rework aimed to fix two main problems she had. The first one being that she was extremely map dependent. And I don't mean in the way that like, oh yeah, Monkey's pretty good on Gibraltar. I mean like, if you weren't on 2CP, she was fecked. And even on 2CP, if you were on second point defense, just get off Symmetra, your ultimate's useless. The other problem it aimed to fix was that she wasn't very active. You'd kind of just sit in a room with your turrets and pray that some dumbass would walk in so that you could ruin their day, and that was that. Now honestly, this first rework did not fix either of these issues at all. It certainly fixed the second one, making her a little bit less map dependent thanks to the shield generator, but it still didn't really help her in general. However, the second rework certainly fixed the two of these. Starting off, let's say the active issue, well, you actually have to aim now, which there is no way about it. In an FPS, that is the most activity you can add to any character. Now look, we're not going to get into a whole aiming debate here, that's a different discussion that I don't even want to have to begin with. But you cannot deny, it certainly increased how much Sim demanded of the player who was playing her. Her right click being changed to actually be useful at long ranges also helped with this. Like before, if you were against a Sim, if you stood 10 meters away from her, she wasn't really able to do much to you, honestly. But by far, the best part of this rework was her new TP. This thing opened up so many possibilities. Whether you were just spamming solo queue, or if you were in a proper team environment, it was amazing. There were new rotations for nearly every map. There were new combos for so many characters. It was so good, and it genuinely added so much depth to her kit. You could teleport a div bomb that was about to explode behind the enemy team and killing them before they realize what's going on. You could teleport your Rhine in behind and he'd shatter the whole team. You could jump gaps previously just impossible for an entire team to cross, like that left side on Volskaya or even the left side on second point Honmura. All these possibilities opened up with the simple addition of a genuinely useful ability. Like, even Team Ireland, in their own scrims, had this strategy called ice bombing, where they would send in a regular TP bomb, which is just 3 Symmetra turrets in a TP, but they would also send in a Mei with it, who would ice block on top of them, meaning that they couldn't destroy the TP or the turrets underneath, and it was just, there physically was nothing you could do, because you can't shoot through a Mei ice block. And her ultimate was way more useful than before. It was genuinely a difference maker in fights now. Personally, I think this rework was a massive success, and while sure it didn't exactly change her popularity overnight, she's still a pretty unpopular character, it was certainly a step in the right direction to increasing both her usage and her usefulness. And it can be argued that it basically just ended her identity crisis right then and there, though a little bit more on that later. But there's one more significant change she got in Overwatch 1, which was actually quite divisive among Sim players, her TP becoming permanent. This gave rise to two different styles of Sim. One close to the old version, where you would just set up a TP near spawn so that people could get back to point a little bit faster, like a worse version of her old TP, but it would last forever. And the other, and much more fun style, was to use the TP to make plays with your team, or place it behind the enemy and TP in and out, effectively having two different angles on them at all times. I didn't think this change was abhorrent or anything, but it certainly wasn't my style and ended up getting removed anyway as we moved into Overwatch 2. And speaking of, Overwatch 2 Symmetra. Good lord, there's so many changes, and I swear half of them are just making a number change and then reverting that number change. So Overwatch 2 Sim. Basically the same as she was in Overwatch 1, but there's a fair few differences. To begin with, thanks to the lack of a second tank, she's gotten so many secondary fire buffs that she can actually exist at range now, which is all well and good, but while playing Sim in order to get footage for this video, I found there is one aspect of her that simply continues to reign supreme. Having a Lucio on your team and just feckin' running down their team at full speed. Unlike Sombra, Sim came into Overwatch 2 with one design goal that was already perfected in Overwatch 1. So she's only ever needed relatively small balance changes, unlike Sombra, who's going strong on 2 reworks as of Overwatch 2. Except in and around July in 2023, Blizzard just did these 2 really weird changes. Like, okay, while it wasn't quite a rework, more of a mini rework, it certainly had the effect of one. Sim gaining shields when damaging shields, and then her turrets doing less damage in exchange for wall hacks. Alright, look, let's look at the first one, the primary fire. Why? Do you know how many characters this is usable against? 10. 10 out of the 40 characters in the game. 1/4 of the whole roster are the only characters this passive is useful against. If the enemy doesn't have a Sim, Venture, Winston, Zarya, Ryan, Ramattra, Sigma, Bald, Break, or Zen, you just don't have this passive. Now, as I said earlier, Sim's reworks have always been made with the goal of fixing her map dependency, literally every single one, and while in the second rework from Overwatch 1, they kind of fixed this, you can definitely tell whether you're playing Overwatch 1 or Overwatch 2, she would still struggle on certain maps. Especially as I was playing Sim for this video, there were some times where I just had to get off her, cause not a thing was being done there. And what does this change really do to help her? It gives her a 1 in 4 chance of doing even better against brawl comps, which she's already brilliant against. And the turret change they gave her. Like, what? I mean, it's handy out, I guess, but like, why? Why are we just lowering the damage for utility? It's just a slight plus? Sim doesn't benefit from wall hacks like how a Hitscan or Hanzo would. She's Symmetra. Do I need to explain why? Like, sure, she did get a buff after a while, but this was like, only about a month ago she got it. It's been 8 months since this change. It brought the turret DPS up to 30, but that's still weaker than before, and for what? Now I know where the diva who killed my turrets is? It doesn't change the fact that I already most likely knew that, since the game would already tell you where her turrets died to begin with. Like, this mini rework aimed to make her less situational, and the only thing it really did was make her more situational and put her back into an identity crisis that was nearly already fixed. It's like Sim's trying to tag team as a supportive DPS who sucks at both 3/4 of the time. Like, look, listen, I'm a DPS player. I love DPS Sim, but I only love her 1/4 of the time when I can play counter swap watch as her. TP strats, whether it's your double angle shenanigans or full on team rotations, are always great, and yes, that is utility, but it works for her primarily, and also just works for her team. Unlike this turret change, which at best helps out your Widow sometimes. A hybrid style is not gonna work, not with the Overwatch 1 rework of Sim that's still being used as the base for her gameplay. Unlike Sombra, who would usually be leaning on decent utility or decent damage, Sim has okay damage, sometimes made better into the right matchups, and barely passable utility that you'll only find useful probably 1 in every 10, maybe even every 20 games. Despite Sim realistically being in a much better and healthier place, there's certainly players who miss her from when she was a support. But unfortunately, with the nature of Overwatch 2, I don't think we could ever see the old Symmetra work in any capacity. She eventually got a healthy, well-designed kit, even though it did take a few reworks, which they proceeded to feck with for the wrong reason and just made her worse anyway. Like, I don't get it, Blizzard. Why? What is that? Like, you're just beating the Sim players when they're already down. The Symmetra players are like the Genji of DP. The analogy doesn't work, but like Symmetra and Genji players, we're both in pain here, like. While it did pick up her usage, usefulness, win rate, play rate, all of that, it definitely didn't make her a popular character whatsoever, but that's just the story with games like these sometimes. As unfortunate as it may be, selecting DPS to have more of a utility and damage-based role doesn't really work out, at the very least in the Overwatch 2 landscape, but it's still true for Overwatch 1 as well. I mean, just look at characters like Torb, Sombra, obviously, Symmetra, we're talking about her right now. All these characters got reworked in some capacity to give them more damage and less utility, because a lot of people didn't really like the utility, and the utility itself wasn't utilized. DPS isn't like the other roles. Support and tanks can have aspects of a DPS thrown into their kit, but the aspects in question is just doing more damage, since both classes have set parameters that can just be lowered. I mean, you can look at Zen, who's obviously designed to be a more of a damage-focused support, who will still provide a little bit of healing and a bit of utility to his team, but the main reason you're going to be picking Zen is because damage, whether that's from Discord or him. You even got Hog as well for tank, who... bad example, that's just a glorified DPS. You can see what I'm saying anyway. If a DPS has some utility thrown into them, well, it throws a wrench into things. Since what do they lose in exchange? Damage. I'd say the one successful utility-based DPS is Mei, but even then in Overwatch 2, she's lost a lot of her utility in favor of damage. Though that's not really a popularity issue, that's just kind of spawned in from the nature of Overwatch 2 and then trying to remove CC from the game, or at the very least more hard CC. But anyway, that's more of a story for a different day. So please, I'd really like to hear it from you. What do you think about Symmetra? Old, new, current, both, all the above, whichever one, whatever one, I don't care. There's so many versions of this girl, so please, tell me which ones you like the best. Which ones you don't like, what would you like to see? Anything of that sort, I really want to hear it. And on that note, I really want to thank you all for the amount of support that the Sombra video was getting. I was not expecting that at all. That's actually like, it fucking blew my mind, basically. So again, thank you all so much. And if you'd like, I was thinking of turning this into a bit of a series, kind of like an Overwatch design discussion type of thing. I don't really want all the videos to be negative because these two Identity Crisis videos, at the very least on paper, they seem like they're a negative discussion of the character. That's not my aim, I just want to talk about Overwatch. I've got a few characters in mind for it, but I would really like to hear your own opinions on it if this is something that you want to see, because so far I think it is, just based off the few comments I got. But again, I'd like to hear it from your mouths after I say it here. So, you know, if there's anything you want to see, whether it's a character in this type of series, or just a different series you'd like to see me make altogether, again, I'd appreciate it, so please, drop any suggestions. But other than that, I'm done for today, so sure look, if you're still here, drop a like, sub, all that YouTube stuff, and I'll talk to you next time, lads.